Call this meeting of the Transportation Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order. Good morning. My name is John McGlennon. I am representing the Virginia Association of Counties, and I am chairing the TSDAC. Let me ask if each of our members would introduce themselves. Kate, can we start with you?
I'm Kate Mattice with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, representing the Virginia Transit Association.
I'm Tom Fox with Blacksburg Transit, representing Community Transportation Association of Virginia.
Cindy Mester, City of Falls Church, representing VML.
Hap Connors, Commonwealth Transportation Board.
Brad Sheffield with John, appointed by Department of Rail, Public Transportation.
Jennifer Mitchell, Director of DRPT.
Thank you. And I just wanted to offer an opportunity to request that we make notice in our minutes for our last meeting that Cindy Mester was observing the meeting electronically, and that may help clarify the fact that I made reference to comments that she had provided during that meeting. So,
thank you, Chair.
Glad to have you here today. We'll start today with some public comment. We have a lot to accomplish today. We are really moving toward conclusion of our considerations on this matter of capital so that we can have a report for the CTB in short order as required by the General Assembly. And let's go ahead and open up public comment. I know we have public comments scheduled for the beginning of this meeting. So if I can ask Mr. Dillard. Good morning.
My name is Joe Dillard. I'm the External and Governmental Affairs Administrator of Hampton Roads Transit. And yesterday there was a webinar with VTA, and Ray Amoruso shared some comments on this process, in particular the major expansion prioritization. One of your members is missing, Dr. Brian Smith. He's actually on vacation, and he kind of helped guide this conversation. And I kind of stand here proud before you guys, Director Mitchell, because it's actually a regional effort. Though you see Hampton Roads Transit on this slide, we worked with partners in WADA, Suffolk Transit, HRPTO, and different groups to try to get some input on this. But we do have some suggestions to offer up that aren't fine-tuned yet, but we're going to get into it. First and foremost, I think we can address the elephant in the room with the removing of the cost effectiveness. I know you guys have the major expansion being spoke of more in detail throughout this presentation, so I kind of try to highlight what these are speaking to. Our concern with the cost effectiveness is the additional points in the overmatch. As it's written now, the only person or the only agency that will benefit from this is Northern Virginia, because they're the only transit agency or transit property region that has a dedicated funding source. Roanoke, Richmond, Hampton Roads, we're trying to get a dedicated funding source, but it will prevent us to come up with that overmatch fund to get more points. So it's kind of secluding, and we're trying to keep it in the guidelines of making sure that one of the TSDAC guidelines of making sure that everything is fair across the board in the Commonwealth. Some other things that we wanted to comment on was the cap total grant funding to anyone in any two regions, no more than 65% in major region expansion funding for one area. I wanted to use LJ as an example because we're Hampton Roads Transit. That's just basically me saying that the Greater Hampton Roads Transit area or Greater Hampton Roads area, including HRT, WADA, Suffolk Transit, and STAR, we can't get more than 65% of the major expansion into that one region, not one agency. We also wanted to talk about, or have you guys discuss, the hold harmless solution. One of the main things that we heard from smaller properties were, if you want to get a bus facility that costs over $2 million, you have to put it into the major expansion project guidelines. That might not score well. So we wanted to put transit facilities and projects that support existing service already into minor expansion projects that'll help the smaller properties to have semi-larger requests. Some of the things that we wanted to modify are the 6 factors, which we pointed out, and I know Brian sent in the email that I'll kind of walk through with the metrics of scoring. I don't have to get into the SMART scale, the process of what's going on right now, but one of the things that we wanted to point out was congestion mitigation and person throughput. One of the transit-specific components that we wanted to add to the SMART scale, which is pretty much, I don't want to say pro-roads because it's a good policy. We want to get something that's more public transportation centric. We wanted to add the increase of available capacity of the transit network mitigation to the use of single occupants in vehicles, so putting that incentive to get you out of your car and onto public transportation for person throughput. And I know it'll be explained more later in the presentation of major expansion. Person hours of delay, one of the transit-specific things that we wanted to include is the decrease in the number of person hours of delay of a project. That's if Chairman McGlennon is on the bus stop today, based on the project presentation, will it avoid or reduce his travel time at any moment? So some of the calculations and methodologies of what we're talking about are still unanswered. It's still a work in progress. Dr. Smith, as well as others in Hampton Roads, are doing a fine job of making sure we're combing through our recommendations, and we're going to be reaching out to other stakeholders across the Commonwealth to make sure that it doesn't just benefit one region, but benefits the Commonwealth as a whole. And I think that's what I have for you guys.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dillard. I appreciate your comments. Do we have any other public comment this morning? Beginning session? No.
Question, do we have a copy of this? He went over it pretty quickly.
We received a draft from Dr. Smith earlier, and was that circulated to everybody? Or?
I don't remember. That would be great because there seems to be a lot of good information and details, and I know I did not capture it all.
This is what I received, and then yesterday we received a second, this precise presentation. Okay. So I assume that one of the things we'll do as we go through our actions this morning will be to try to address the concerns that were raised in that presentation as well. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, with no other public comment, we'll move on. And our first item would be an outline and key policy questions. Jen?
Following along how we've kind of started each of the last few meetings is just wanted to kind of set the stage for today's discussion. We do have a lot to cover. To give you an update of what we've had going on since the last meeting, we did update the outline of policy principles that we had been working on that was sent out with the package. We've continued to do a significant amount of outreach to agencies around the Commonwealth. We've hit, I think, pretty much every MPO now in the state, and we're working on outreach to transit agencies and other organizations as well. For today's discussion, we've focused on major expansion and the policy questions around that that we started the discussion of last month, and today we're going to get into more specifics about the measures and the application of scoring based on those measures. At the last meeting, based on the discussion that we had, we talked about weighting. We talked about using the smart scale weights with an option for discussion and review by the MPO in regions around the state. We did talk about the benefit score and the cost basis to do that ratio that's shown on the chart over on the right-hand side. Based on our notes and where we thought we left off was that we were going to divide that total benefit score by the state transit capital requested for the project. For today, we're focusing on measures with the goal, as we discussed last time, to maintain similarity to Smart Scale, but with measures that are appropriate for a transit-only application pool. So trying to tailor measures in those factor areas that are specific to transit projects, while we utilize existing sources of data and existing resources that are available both to transit agencies and to the state. Also today, we want to review the policy principles, make some additional revisions, as that will serve as the basis for us moving forward with drafting a policy for the Commonwealth Transportation Board that we will bring back to you in a draft form in September. And with that,
Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about how we will have an opportunity to address the issues that were raised in Mr. Dillard's comments as provided by Dr. Smith. Will that be something that Tom Harrington will focus on during the course of his discussion, or is it appropriate for us to ask throughout that presentation about the issues that are raised?
Certainly, we can address it through the presentation as it pertains to the measures. The last couple of slides that we're talking about the measures and the measures being shaped for transit projects. I think Tom has addressed that in what he's bringing forward today. Some of the other questions about the application, or some of the other concerns about the application of the cost-benefit score dividing by the state transit capital requested. Those, I think, are more policy or program structure type questions that are not part of Tom's presentation, but we can certainly discuss those either before or after Tom's presentation.
Okay.
Yes. I've done a quick search, and I can't seem to find an email with that presentation or
trying to
the
send it
document. So if you could.
We got it at 5 o'clock yesterday.
Okay, so I can look at
I'm trying
it
to send it to you guys right now.
while we have the discussion. So maybe based on that, I would appreciate Tom's presentation, and then we can come back to make sure we.
And Dr. Smith had sent, and I thought it went to the entire TISDAC. It wasn't until late yesterday that I realized it hadn't gone to the TISDAC. It went to the chair and myself and some other folks from the Hampton Roads region. There was about a 3-page document that he had put together, but it was prior to us distributing any of the materials for this meeting. So some of those things are addressed. Some of the items that he brought up in that narrative are addressed in Tom's presentation and today's discussion about the measures. Some of the other aspects that have to do with the program structure are part of the policy principles, and some of those things are things that this body has already discussed, and we thought we had some resolution on that we would need to go back to potentially discuss as part of those policy principles later on today. So I can find that if that additional papers of benefit, I can find that and share it as well.
Date on that one was June 26, 2018. So the original comments that Brian Smith sent.
I'll forward that to the group as well.
Okay.
Full thank you.
Okay, well then I guess we'll move on to presentation on major expansion project prioritization. Tom Harrington. And I just note that Jim Dyke has now joined us. Thank you, Jim. Oh, I think we all understand that.
Good morning. I'm Tom Harrington with Cambridge Systematics, and we'll pick up kind of where we left at the last meeting with the focus on the major expansion type projects. Again, as we discussed at the last meeting, the major expansion prioritization focuses on 6 factor areas or criteria that were specified in the legislation that are aligned with smart scale. So they look very familiar to those who know smart scale. The process, as shown here, would involve calculating a benefit score using those 6 criteria. It would then compare the benefit score to the cost of the project. And at the last meeting, we talked about that being the state share, the transit capital of the project. And then from that, we would have a ranked, a prioritized list of projects, major expansion projects. And then those would be applied basically to the funding rules that have been discussed previously that would dictate how funds are allocated between state-of-good repair, minor enhancement, and the major expansion projects. So at our last meeting, we discussed quite a bit issues of the weighting and the cost benefit, and sort of resolved at that meeting that the smart scale weighting would be the default, but that there's some flexibility and that DRPT is open to looking at what's appropriate for each region. We also talked about the benefit score being divided by cost, and that the assumption is that that would be relative to the state share of the transit capital funding requested. So at this meeting, we're going to focus more on the evaluation measures themselves. As we've talked about previously, the assumption is these will be similar to the smart scale measures, but we want to find measures that are appropriate for transit projects. And given this will be a transit-only application pool, we want measures that would allow us to basically find the most promising transit projects, the ones with the greatest benefit. And some specifics also in that process are how you take those scores and you scale them and what we call normalize them, so you can combine all the scores into one project score. And then we talked a little bit about the smart scale results last meeting and how that might apply, and so we'll come back to that again to give us a sense of how these different measures would perform in terms of ranking projects. Okay, so the 6 factor areas specified in HB 1539, again, are the same as smart scale. Those include congestion mitigation, economic development, accessibility, safety, environmental quality, and land use. Now I'll walk through each of these areas and describe a proposed measure or measures for each of the factor areas. For congestion mitigation, we're proposing one measure, and that is in effect, the potential benefit of the project in terms of increasing transit users served. And the connection with congestion mitigation is the idea that we're providing alternative to SOV travel. So increasing the number of transit users is a benefit in terms of the roadway system. And we're looking, in effect, at the change in the transit system ridership attributed to the project. The methodology is fairly straightforward for projects like a BRT project, where you've got a ridership, an expected ridership, and for many of these major capital projects, there are other, a lot of these are pursuing federal money. They may have already done lots of planning and feasibility studies that will have looked at ridership. Where this gets a little more complicated is for a non-fixed guideway type project, major expansion project such as fleet expansion or maintenance facility, where it may not be straightforward about the ridership. And what we've laid out is just at a high level, there will be an estimate of the ridership potential of the project. In a case of something that serves the system, you would look at how much service is supported by that investment. So obviously, if it's a big fleet expansion, how much new service could be supported by that fleet expansion. If it's a maintenance facility, same idea. Expanding either the storage or maintenance capacity of the agency, how much additional service can be supported. And I will say, as we go through these are all draft methodologies, and really I think the intent of today's meeting is to agree on what gets measured, as opposed to the very specific steps in the methodology which will have to be worked out as we proceed. But I think this gives you a high-level feel for what this measure might look like. And I will say this particular one corresponds well with what was in Brian Smith's notes, for example, again about ridership, and the notion that you would you'd want to capture ridership potential for things other than fixed guideway. So this was one of those areas that were covered in his notes as well. What we also, though, are proposing is really just one measure for congestion mitigation. So in smart scale, there's a delay measure, and given the challenges of calculating that for a range of transit type projects, and the fact that it really in smart scale is aligned more with traffic improvements, we felt like the transit users was sort of the best or most appropriate measure for this criteria area.
I think overall, understanding, of course, congestion mitigation is one of 6, and some projects may do well in one area versus another. I think you've got, really captured this well. I know one thing I'll want to look at as we dive into, or as the details get refined, is ridership when. Is it immediately as soon as you get them? Is it a year later? I mean, these are, again, major expansions, so I'm thinking like a brand new something. And so what is when you talk about a forecast for ridership, what is that defined at? Again, that's not for here, but just keeping in mind what that looks like moving forward.
What's the current practice with smart scale in terms of forecast year? Is it like 5 years out, I think, or?
Well, it started with a 10-year horizon for that, but they've moved back to looking at existing impacts on some of the measures. So I think you could make the case these are major expansion projects. You would probably want to look out in the future. So I think 10-year may be appropriate. I think you'd want to look at sort of when the funding was forecast. Of course, for a number of projects, you may have an opening year forecast, then you may have a future year forecast, which tends to be your 20-year forecast. So I think there definitely are some, those are probably the three options on the table. Something that's closer to a sort of 10-year opening year, something that would be what would the project look like if it opened today, and something that's more of a 20-year forecast. And I think there are advantages to all three of those that we'd want to look at. Okay. Next area, can we move on? Okay, is economic development. And this one in Smart Scale has three measures. We're focused on one of the measures, and this is very much aligned with Smart Scale, the project support for economic development measure. And this assesses if the project is supporting future economic development and sort of what progress is being made toward development in the corridor. And specifically looking at that project's consistency with regional and local economic development plans and policies and support for local development. As with Smart Scale, this is a qualitative measure in the sense that it's looking at, is this project referenced in local either comprehensive plans or economic development strategy documents? And in Smart Scale, this looks at if a transportation project is located in an area of economic distress. And then sort of one of the key features of a qualitative measure is that in order to be able to compare it with cost, we want to scale it by basically the impact of that project. And in Smart Scale, it's actually scaled or factored by the square footage of the development. We have explored ways to simplify that. That is one area of Smart Scale that probably gets the most comment in terms of it being challenging and very time consuming. And so to simplify, there are two things that we've mentioned. I think in previous meetings we talked about potentially looking at sort of buckets of development as opposed to counting every last square foot. Another approach here on scaling is to look at the change in the number of forecasted jobs. So that would be something that would be readily available to look at within the project's area of influence or study area. What's the change in jobs that would be supported by the project? So we do know we need to scale it, and I think the idea is to tie it to the future development in that area.
Can I just ask about how this connects to redevelopment as opposed to new development, greenfield development, since for distressed areas in particular, that's likely to be a major aspect of economic development?
We've mentioned that at previous meetings. In Smart Scale, the focus is really on that greenfield development. Right. And I know the intent here is because transit often is part of a redevelopment strategy, we want to capture that. So I think when we look at if we did it with forecasted jobs, I think that would capture job growth, whether it be in new greenfield development or whether it be redevelopment of an existing area. So I think that's one advantage of looking at change in jobs. If we were going to go with something more square footage based, I think we want to be careful to incorporate a redevelopment square footage as well. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was one of my colleagues' question too. Is this seems to emphasize future development? What about existing development where a transit service is expanded into? How do we account for that? And I think that goes to your question too.
Yeah, I think that came across loud and clear, I think, in prior meetings about that redevelopment being important to capture.
I would like to just reinforce the redevelopment piece, because it's not just distressed communities, it could be an already built out community, like the city of Falls Church, where we're going to redevelop. So there probably is some increased square footage because we're going up, but it's really more the jobs than the land. And so redevelopment, but also existing businesses and jobs where if we can get less cars on the road, it moves. So I think all of those points. And just to be consistent on the definition, I would like to ask if maybe the comprehensive plan be referenced and just not policies. It is sort of down under the methodology. And that's because for local governments, a comp plan is very different than a local economic development plan, and not every locality will have an ED plan.
Just wanted to also add, as we look at economic development, to factor in the effort on Go Virginia, where we're basically trying to identify areas for potential growth, And not that that would drive this decision, but I think that's something that you might incorporate when you're reviewing these things as well, to see how that fits with what the future projections are for that area and what they're trying to attract to that area, to see what relevance it might have, just as a thought, as a factor.
Development.
It's more for the committee maybe to respond to, but from a workforce development standpoint, would that be an area to put into this component to somehow, if a transit system can show that they're not only impacting the economic development, but the ability to develop its workforce? Because you mentioned Go Virginia, the workforce to some degree. Yeah. So there's some synergy there. Typically, economic development plans should have a workforce component, but it would be helpful because if a system is doing some sort of major expansion that is tying to existing neighborhoods or communities that had that weak connection in the past, the economic impact can be measured, but also the workforce impact can be measured. I don't know if the committee is interested in expanding that definition a little bit more beyond just economics to include workforce.
I mean, would mean in terms of connecting to training facilities, to literacy programs, to other aspects of the community?
It comes in different forms in different localities, but just having workforce somehow into this measure, I don't know what form that would take, but to give staff direction to take that into account, but if the committee doesn't think it's as critical.
I think it's important because it's very consistent with what I said about Go Virginia, because that is a clear major component of what we're doing there.
You could work it so it still ends up addressing job growth if that's the core measure. We just make sure it's included.
This sounds completely consistent.
Just one more question. So if you have an area that's already developed, but you have no service currently, do we measure, do we count for new service to that area? I mean, how do we?
Yeah, that's, I think, the within walk distance of the project piece of this, that we would look at the buffer. And so if you're expanding service, you have more coverage, you would actually get credit for more jobs that are served. So I think that's one way to capture that.
New access, but not necessarily new development.
That I believe is captured in the accessibility factor as well, which we'll get to.
Yeah, there's a little bit of overlap on some of these measures, but again, I think the intent here, if you go back to the objective, is this one focused on how's the project supporting economic development, and then accessibility is more access related, but obviously a little bit of overlap there. Okay, I'll move on. Okay. Next one is accessibility. On this factor area, we're proposing two measures. The first is access to jobs. And so this looks at access to employment opportunities due to the project. And it's tied, by definition with accessibility in terms of the improvement in transit travel time to jobs. We're looking at some different approaches on the methodology, but what we're expecting is a GIS-based analysis looking at the number of jobs that can be reached due to the transit project, and kind of considering the expected travel time benefits of the project. So I think that's basically the focus of that measure. The second measure is closely related and would essentially be calculated the same way, but the focus is more on the home end, and particularly looking at disadvantaged populations. In SMART scale, this includes low-income, minority, or limited English proficiency within walk distance of the project. And again, it would be a GIS-based analysis looking at the population that can access transit within the, and sort of the benefit in terms of the expected travel time savings of the project. So both would be similar, but would get at two different dimensions of accessibility.
See what you mean about the overlap between accessibility and the economic development aspect. I'm a little curious again about again the distinction between transportation for single occupancy vehicles and public transit when it comes to the more congested, the the more dense urban areas, how much reduction in travel time is reasonable to anticipate, especially as one of the goals is to increase density in those areas so that transit is more efficient. Are we kind of creating a barrier for transit in that regard?
Well, I think when we talk about transit time, we're not just talking about the time on the vehicle. We're also considering the frequency of the service and the walk time. And often it's the wait time and the walk time have a bigger impact on someone's ride experience. So even in congested areas, you know, getting more stops or coverage so you walk shorter distances and having service come more frequently can have a big impact on accessibility.
So those would be things that would be taken into account with these measures. Okay. Thank you.
Chair, could I just ask if Tom could expand a little bit about the GIS analysis and who's doing it and whose GIS data is being utilized?
Well, I think some of the specific details are still going to be worked out. I think you know, in terms of smart scale, I can speak to that. That is done with a statewide database where they do have transit network and highway network for the whole state, and basically it's using a GTFS representation of the transit network. But I think that's one of the issues I think we're going to be looking at in terms of what's, this gets back to the time required to calculate some of these measures and what's reasonable, and wanting to capture things like frequency and walk time. And so I think we're going to look at the tools that are available in terms of what's most appropriate.
And I think, you know, our expectation at least is that where if a system doesn't have those resources to perform an analysis itself, that's something that we could do on behalf of that. And right now, all of that work is being done by the Office of Intermodal, for Smart Scale, is being done by the state, essentially. VDOT and the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment does that actual analysis for Smart Scale applications, but I think again, that's something that if the grantee had access to GIS and could do those analyses, they could do that, or we could do it through DRPT. So.
The transit development plans have some GIS work done related to that. Jen, I don't think they do more of the housing and jobs analysis. It's more just ridership related to, but part of that component of the strategic plan requirement is possibly enhancing the TDP aspect to look at jobs and housing, which would allow for that to be addressed. And it's done by an independent entity, so it's probably would be a little bit more palatable. So that's probably the best venue for that type of analysis, my thought.
I think that while we're not necessarily at that point, if we're going to kind of agree that this is the foundation, we need to think through that, because when we think about the principles that Brian reminded us of, keeping it simple and manageable, but it's also consistent. So on the smart scale, while I may not always agree on the data input for a specific locality like mine, at least it's consistent and it's being applied. And so you have a core foundation that's a good base. So I think we do need to make sure that we're not putting a burden on the transit agencies or.
But for Smart Scale, for example, they don't use GIS, they use a very sophisticated modeling tool, but we recognize that that's not appropriate for our program. So we're proposing something that's a much more common tool that many people have, which is GIS. We also have access to that as well, and if it makes sense from a consistency standpoint to just have DRPT doing all of those analyses, that can be done too. And we don't get a lot of applications every year for major expansion, and so that's something that could be done too. But it's, yeah, again, this is actually the simplified measure compared to Smart Scale, just so you know.
I think from a locality perspective, we have all GIS. I just am not as familiar with what a transit agency would have and what the impact is. But even I know in Northern Virginia, we're always still trying to clarify the data amongst ourselves for accuracy.
If it helps any, I think some of the things that we've talked about a little bit internally is not wanting to go to something as complex as what is done for Smart Scale, because that is, no offense to my partners that have been a great help to us, but that is something that requires consultants and costs a lot, and it's, I mean, generally we're dealing with less than 12 projects a year. And so that's something that we, as an agency, think with the tools that we have available and the data that we have available, we can do this analysis ourselves with data that we have, where we're not asking for a lot of additional information from the transit agencies. So that's our goal.
Okay. Are we ready to move on to the next?
Yeah. This one is safety. And here the objective is evaluating the project's contribution to improving safety and security and reducing the risk of fatalities or injuries. And specifically, this measure would assign points based on the direct safety benefit. So this is essentially a qualitative rating. Examples of what the criteria might be in terms of assigning a qualitative score would be different elements of projects that are in there. So there's a safety benefit that's asset condition related. So, in effect, if you're building or constructing new major facilities or fleet expansion that brings down fleet age, that has a safety benefit. There's technology related safety elements. And some of those could be very direct, onboard cameras, crash avoidance systems being examples that you get a score benefit for safety. And then customer facility improvements, bus stops or waiting areas with lighting, improved pedestrian access, such as sidewalks and things like that. So we would basically have a checklist of elements that contribute to safety. And then, again, as I said, with these qualitative measures, it would be scaled by, in terms of the impact, the daily transit person miles that are served by the project. And again, that goes back to the philosophy behind Smart Scale, which is that transit's inherently a safer mode than having folks drive. And so the more people are using transit, generally there's a safety benefit from that as well. So that scaling helps capture that piece of it too.
Just so, again, a little bit of editorializing. I think however this gets presented, starting with what you finished with, which is the recognition that just by doing transit is a much safer mode. I think that's important because I know I've always had a really difficult time trying to figure out how to do the safety when you're already talking about one of the safest modes of transportation. I do appreciate putting the customer facility improvements because safety is not just about the crashes, it's actually about the safety of the passengers. And so I'm really delighted to see that in there.
Okay, the next is environmental quality. In Smart Scale, there are two measures, an air quality and energy impact measure, and also one that's really natural resource impact. And we talked about that a little bit at our last meeting, and kind of concluded that air quality and energy benefit is appropriate for transit. The natural resource one, maybe less so, because it, again, is really all about sort of roadway impacts. So we got the one measure proposed, and this is really the potential of the project to improve air quality and reduce energy use, and it really would be measured through expected VMT reduction due to transit. Similar to the congestion mitigation one, for fixed guideway projects, this is fairly straightforward because most project plans in coming up with a transit ridership would also have an estimate or be able to estimate the VMT reduction. Trickier for non-fixed guideway projects where, again, we would look at what's expected in terms of the ridership potential and then have to make assumptions about the average trip length and auto occupancy to get at a VMT reduction number. Another potential idea, and this is similar to Smart Scale also, would be getting credit for certain other specific project elements that contribute to environmental benefits. And so that could be the example of energy efficient fleet, or infrastructure. And this, again, is totally an example, but just to show you could get credit, say, in terms of VMT reduction for having certain elements there. So that last bullet is really just an example, if we wanted to try to capture more directly specific environmental benefits.
I think that's really important as fleets move more toward alternative vehicles like electric to get credit for the air quality improvements and energy reductions from electric vehicles versus diesel.
Likewise, I'd like to echo that. I think that if there's an opportunity to recognize any of these hybrid electric or what have you in here, I think is really important. Also, facilities and the use of some, if there's a demonstration of energy efficient facilities, because we can't forget those in here too, right? And so, again, I don't know how we quantify that, but I think that that's a nice way to get the environmental quality.
You know, we could look at facilities that meet certain LEED standards. You know, there are ways you could incorporate facilities as well.
I would want to encourage that. I feel like Kate brought up the facilities piece because you do have LEED. I would say Energy Star, something more, because LEED doesn't do enough on energy, and solar panels to help with a lot of that. And the economic development, we talked a lot about it being consistent with comp plan and economic development strategies. This is also an area where you have a lot of plans adopted regionally or by the locality, and it might be a way to measure the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions or some other goals that have been adopted by a locality.
Move on. Next.
Last of the 6 criteria is land use. And this is one where I think we're aligned pretty well with smart scale. So looking at transit supportive land use matches up pretty well with the definition of what's been looked at for smart scale. So this looks at both future density as well as the change in density expected. Now, smart scale, actually, this measure changed last year where it was incorporating non-work accessibility using that sophisticated accessibility tool we talked about. This would go back to just kind of the straight definition that smart scale had in place, which is looking at future jobs and population density within the project buffer, and then looking at the growth or the change from existing density up to future density. That was incorporated to sort of balance out areas that you know, have a lot of future density expected, and also just those that are making a big change related to the project. That's kind of why both elements were incorporated. But bottom line is, you know, we want to give more credit to projects that are located in areas that have the right types of land use or are planning to have that right types of land use in place. So.
Yes, where I'm struck, and go back to our conversation about economic development before, is what this appears to capture is a delta and a change, and that's great in a number of places within the region. Other places, though, have stuff already happening right now, and so the delta may be less, but there's still a ton of good land use decisions that are going on. You may be redeveloping, and so I'm just don't know if how well the future thing captures that. If you already have really good land use now, how does that get captured here?
Yeah, so just to piggyback on that a little bit, think about the notion that you've got a well-planned land use that has been in place for a long time but has not been served by transit previously. So the expansion of transit into that, how's that captured in this?
Again, it's measured over the project buffer, so you know, in a sense, you're looking at the area that would be served by the project. I would say, yeah, go ahead.
Some of those may also be captured in the accessibility guideline, where you are capturing the amount of development within walking distance to the stations too. And I do understand your point, though, is this is looking at the delta in the future versus.
I can just give you like a perfect example, sort of as we think of, there's a couple different corridors in Northern Virginia. I'm more familiar with Route 7, where we already are taking, you know, whatever, 10,000 riders a day, and we look at it being able to increase. It's actually more than that. It's like 20,000 or what have you. That whole corridor is ripe for redevelopment, but it's already got Tyson's, and there's already a lot of great stuff. And again, it's actually providing more frequent service because the buses are already packed full. And so that's what and again, it might be captured other places, but if we were going to talk about weighting later, and if this isn't truly 20%, it gets me a little nervous if it's only about going from nothing to high density, somehow gets lost when there's already, you know, a lot of density around there. Maybe I'm not making sense. But.
This is one of those examples where I think the measure was actually a bit of a compromise, recognizing that some areas already have that very high density and that their future density would be very high. Other areas may not have super high future density, but would have a big change. And so they sort of balance both pieces with this measure. That's why it looks a little clumsy, awkward, that you have the future density and then you add it to the growth and density. But I think that was an attempt to balance those two things.
I would agree with Kate. I think this probably needs a little bit of work in trying to figure out how to reward those localities that already have the density that supports it, as well as those that have good plans for future density, and not actually have them compete against each other, because this almost does that. It relates to my question that we had last time, and that is also infrastructure. If a locality is already invested in the infrastructure that supports transit versus possibly going to have it, they shouldn't be competing against each other, but they are equal in a sense. If there's a sidewalk project in the CIP and the funds are committed, that should be factored in. Just like if there's incentives in place for future density, that should be factored in. But again, existing infrastructure, existing land uses. If localities have done the work, then they're responding to the needs. That's important. So.
On land use on this particular component? And I just would want to make a sort of general observation about this, that one of the things we need to keep in mind is the degree to which there is, obviously, some of these criteria bleed into the others, and just making sure that we're not double counting to the extent that we're, sort of stacking the deck in favor of certain criteria versus others beyond the percentage share that they're allocated. I don't know.
Was someone as Tom mentioned, I think the land use measure, at least in smart scale, was intended to capture those future changes, whereas accessibility captures kind of the existing conditions and existing density. But again, I don't know if there's a different way that we can also provide some credit for localities that have already made decisions years before in transit supportive.
We're just making that a little bit more explicit in terms of the indicators, the measures, so that we can point to the fact that yes, this is being captured in this other area, might be helpful.
Point. I've never written one of these proposals, so I don't. Should we encourage people to show us to write to the overlap? If there are 3 advantages, or if there's an advantage in a project that's touching all 3 scores, should we encourage them to do that, and should they be rewarded for recognizing the overlap? And does that give them a bonus advantage in scoring? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Again, the tension here is between wanting to make sure that they are ticking as many boxes as we can to get the most bang for the buck, and at the same time not sort of privileging a particular project because it happens to have the ability to hit into several criteria. So it's a difficult question.
If somebody wrote a proposal that captured 3 measures in one, I think that would be a good thing.
Yes, right. I guess the question is whether you're going to capture 3 separate measures, or you're going to reward one measure in 3 categories.
I think I would agree. I think if you could show that connection, to me, that's a huge plus. Yeah. And I think that's something that you would want to point out. Right. And that we ought to factor that in when we look at it.
Yeah, don't disagree.
I think I had one comment, but to follow up on that thought, I think is where we can keep them as distinct as possible. There is going to be bleeding, but if they're distinct, then it's easier to apply and easier to score and not have unintended consequences by scoring something too high just because they get the same score in all 3 areas. For the land use one, I think the discussion of trying to talk about accessibility as existing and land use as future is good, as long as the accessibility does capture the point like Kate brought up, where you already have existing development but you got too many cars and you're overriding your buses, so you're expanding it. So there's a transit gap versus a density gap, and somehow we need to capture that. The other thing for the land use one, it's headed for transit-supported land use, and I want us to make sure that when we're doing the definition and the methodology, that density and that growth is transit-supported, because we can do a lot of locality density growth and building roads, and that would be counterproductive in this effort and that methodology. So because I didn't see transit-supported in that definition, I just wanted to flag that I would want to make sure that's defined that way.
Just, well, if there's no more land use questions, it's more of a general one to DRPT staff, but my understanding last time was that DRPT is usually pretty involved in a smart scale application before it goes to VDOT. What's the expectation for major expansion applications coming to y'all directly? Because that's probably a unique factor here, is that you don't have VDOT that involved in the application, but we do have DRPT that involved to help guide some of these questions that could come up.
I would anticipate that we would be very engaged with the applicant as they're developing the application. That's what our folks are doing right now on smart scale applications, and those go to OIP, not to VDOT. So we're kind of going through some changes even on the smart scale side, trying to kind of feel out our involvement. Now that we're in round 3, I think we've learned a lot of things, but I would envision that we would be engaged before the application starts, because those major expansion projects should be coming out of a strategic plan or transit development plan. It shouldn't be something that just kind of pops up and lands at DRPT on February 1st in an application. I mean, I think it's going to be a long, engaged process, but certainly we would be there to support the agencies in applying.
And what they've done with Smart Scale, they've actually moved up the application cycle quite a bit so that people can start developing their applications in, sort of the spring for the following fiscal year. I don't think we'll have the luxury of doing that this year, given the timing of our application cycle, but that is something we could consider in future years, that rather than waiting until February 1st, you need to start working with DRPT in August or something so we can start the application process. I think that's something we need to figure out, is what the appropriate timing will have to be, so it gives us enough time to do all the analysis that's needed.
We actually started planting the seeds for that earlier application deadline last year when we knew kind of where the Revenue Advisory Board report was, and we saw this coming, recognizing that we would, as prioritization moves forward, need more time. We're not going to have it this year, but we've got to figure out that balance, because what we've heard from the transit agencies is we don't want to move that application date too early, because then it impacts, you don't know that much about your local budget cycle. We're trying to sync up a lot of different time frames. So it's something that we have to look at going into the future.
I also have a more general, stepping back, really question for DRPT and then how it may fit into this, is that we've got a number of different benefit scores. How will DRPT also look at the financial and technical capacity of transit agencies who are applying for these? And again, I'm going to go back to my knowledge of the sort of the Federal Transit Administration. Is there a demonstration, or will there need to be a demonstration that, let's say, a major expansion, does that transit agency have already got a financial plan for how they're going to pay to operate it?
I don't think that's something that would be captured in these criteria. But as an eligibility issue, certainly we would work with a grantee. We would, we require to see that there's a plan for local match and for other funding sources. For example, in the past, when grantees have started moving forward with major projects, we've started to get engaged in upfront sort of the project management process and making sure that they have technical capacity as well. So I envision that's something that will still occur.
Okay.
But it's going to depend on the nature of the project. It's not necessary as much for a, bus purchase as it is for a major capital project. So I think that's something that will happen anyway. But I don't think that would be captured in these kinds of criteria.
That's one of the questions that came out at the VTA webinar was, obviously demonstrating that these projects are going to succeed, and we all want this to succeed. And so making sure that any of these, especially major expansion, again, you're talking maybe 12 projects a year, they actually are going to succeed because they've been revenues have been identified that can pay for the new service or what have you. And so I'm just being sensitive to that.
And we were doing that, for example, with the Virginia Beach project. We were working with them years in advance on technical capacity and a project management plan and things like that. So while that project didn't move forward, that's the type of thing I imagine we would still do. So.
Started incorporating some of that into our program application guidance last year, and I've mentioned a couple of times that with our infrastructure projects, we changed last year. Instead of just having applicants coming in and asking for a little bit of money and a little bit of money, we've said, break it into 3 parts. feasibility, preliminary design to get up to 30%. But once you get to 30%, you need to have a financial plan. You need to know more about how you're going to deliver that project before you come in and ask for funding. And I think that ties into the discussion we had last time, really trying to lay out a path for these projects to move forward. It's not going to solely be based on the transit capital program because it's just not enough funding there. So at that point, when somebody has a good concept and a good cost estimate is when there needs to be a dialogue about which other places, and we can help with that, you go to fund the package of the project.
All right, move on. Sure. All right, last slide on this piece is scaling and normalizing. I just want to define these things here. You've seen that for some of the two qualitative measures that were proposed are economic development and safety. And so for those, they are scaled by a factor representing the project size. This is a feature of Smart Scale when they very quickly realized that if you took a few points and then divided by cost, you couldn't take account for big projects having big benefits and small projects having small benefits. And so in economic development, we are in effect factoring by the number of jobs supported around the project, and for safety, proposed scaling by transit person miles. The second piece of this is normalizing, that if we're going to take 6 different measures that are calculated differently, they're all going to be on different scales, and in order to combine them into one score, we want to put them on a 0 to 100 scale or something where we can combine the scores. And so in Smart Scale, that's actually recalculated every year, where it's all done on the projects that are submitted. Just in some of our preliminary discussions, I think the intent here is, first of all, it would be normalized against a transit project, but rather than doing it based on what happens in year 1, there would be sort of a maximum score set, and everything would be relative to that. That would be the 100-point score, and this needs to be worked out a little bit, but I just wanted to point out, you need a way to combine the scores together. Okay. The next part of this was really to go back and look at Smart Scale. Again, the measures we're proposing are a little different, but in order to get a sense of, well, what impact might these measures have, how would a project be scored, the Smart Scale experience is informative. And so we had done some analysis previously where we took the projects that had been submitted in round 1 and 2 of Smart Scale. These are shown here. I think one thing you'll see as you go through these, a whole range of projects. So we have some that are fleet expansion, some that are customer facilities. We have a lot of sort of parking at rail stations, that sort of thing. A whole range of benefit scores, but what you do see, an example I can pick out there, you have some VRE capacity expansion has the highest benefit score of 64.25. That's close to the bottom of the page there. Ranked number 1 on benefit, but when you bring cost into the picture, suddenly that project drops pretty far down the list there. So again, that is definitely a feature of Smart Scale that when you bring cost into play, sometimes the very expensive projects may have a lot of benefit, but if they are expensive, it changes their ranking overall.
It was funded.
But was funded.
Yes. Do you want to point that out?
Yeah.
So while it's an important point though. So while it does, when you add in the cost, it does change that. But this project still, by virtue of the benefit score, was still selected. So.
Yeah, and these scores that I'm showing are how it ranked compared to all projects, including highway projects, on this particular page. And last meeting we went. Oh, did you have a point?
I just have a question because we had said earlier about if there's cost effectiveness put in, it'd be based on the quote state share. Is that the DRPT capital program share of the project or the state share if they happen to get other state funding for that project? I just want to make sure we're really.
This came up last month,
yeah,
or last meeting, and I think I said it would be the transit capital share.
Perfect. I just
because we do want systems to be able to leverage Smart Scale and other sources of funding. So
in Smart Scale, was it the total? Was the cost against the total project cost or the Smart Scale share of the cost?
Actually report both, but typically the Smart Scale share of the cost is the one that's often referred to as the Smart Scale score.
Okay, that's fine.
our last meeting, I think we covered, our last couple meetings, we covered what all the various measures. This is more for reference. I think as we've gone through, though, you can think back to what we just presented, where we've really tried to pick one, or in the case of accessibility, two measures that are aligned with smart scale, but are really more focused on transit. So just kind of move on. The other reason I put that up there is from looking at transit projects, we get a sense of how they did on the smart scale scoring. And so just kind of quickly walk through each factor area. Compared to non-transit projects, congestion, which is the delay and throughput measures, actually had a smaller contribution to the overall transit project scores. So not too surprising. I think there are other areas where transit projects can have more opportunity. But in terms of delay reduction, they tended not to have as much as some of the highway projects. On safety, transit projects scored slightly higher on average. And again, part of that is that they, again, transit is viewed as inherently safer, so the more transit use, the safer, and the higher the safety score. For safety, it was just one measure, the overall impact on crashes, not the crash rate calculated for transit. Accessibility compared to non-transit projects, this actually is the greatest contributing factor for transit project scores. For smart scale, that's partly because one of the measures is multimodal accessibility, and transit projects inherently get a very high score for that one, so that should be considered when we look at that. Environmental quality, transit projects scored well on both of the environmental measures, again, because they have components that sort of help reduce VMT. Economic development was not as significant for, the economic development support was not as significant for transit compared to non-transit. Transit projects tended to do better on the second measure, which was intermodal access, which I think was specifically for rail projects where that had an impact. And finally, land use was the factor that on average contributed the largest share to transit project scores. We tend to have a lot of transit projects that are in some fairly dense areas that have accessibility, so that tended to be where a lot of them picked up points.
Chairman,
yep.
Can you explain why congestion?
Yeah, I think it's because it includes both the delay and the throughput, and transit projects typically are not designed to reduce delay per se. I think they tend to do better on the person throughput part of that. And again, it doesn't mean that they didn't have a contribution to this. I think this is really saying of all the pieces of a transit project score, where did they get the most points? And it just tended to be land use and accessibility was where they tended to pick up the most.
With the region, with the 45% congestion weight, it seems to me that is kind of significant.
And again, for both delay and throughput, transit projects do better if they have higher ridership. I think it tends to be that in those more dense urban areas, particularly Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, transit projects do tend to have a little bit higher ridership. So I think they did okay in that area. I'm just saying it wasn't the main contributing factor.
Thank you.
Yep. And then what we also did as an exercise is we had compared, well, what if it was just transit project against transit project? What types of transit projects would score well? When we pulled out the measures that were specific to transit, sort of an attempt to see how they would do. And so we had combined the scores here. These were sort of weighted using the current smart scale weights, which is consistent with what we've talked about for this policy. And these are average scores, so we try to get a sense of sort of where different projects would shake out. What you saw is that the corridor high capacity transit, so those being BRT and rail type projects, had the highest overall benefits, and that's not too surprising. I think that's what we kind of expect, that those have big impacts on accessibility and some of the travel time benefits. Admin and maintenance facilities did quite well on overall benefits. Again, those tend to support a lot of service, so that helped on accessibility. And you kind of see how it shakes out. I think an important thing to look at on this is just the benefit score. And then on the next slide, we took that benefit score and we looked at how it did when you brought cost into the equation. And you'll see that the ordering changed quite a bit, that whereas the corridor projects did best on benefit, when you divide by cost, it's actually the vehicle expansion type projects did better on the cost effectiveness. So again, this is just looking at a small pool of projects, but just to get a sense of how different types of projects may fare when we use these types of benefit measures and divide by cost. So this was part of some of the analysis we did last year when we were trying to show you examples of how different projects would score. Okay. This is provided for reference. Again, we talked a bit about weighting at the last meeting and concluded that we would, the default would be to use the SMART scale weighting. But again, this varies by region within the state. And there are 4 different weighting schemes, A through D.
This was near the end of the meeting, and I had suggested that possibly this map get revised to reflect more of the FTA urbanized areas versus the MPO areas, because you have some areas of an MPO that are not in an urbanized area, which means they use a different source of federal funds and have different expectations. So if a project falls in or out of those type of areas, it just could be impacted differently from other funding sources. So I don't know if the committee might need to see what kind of map that would look like versus this. I just know it also addressed Brian's concern about regions within regions that differ as well. Again, those urbanized areas are defined by the federal government every 10 years based on the census. It's what all the 5307 funds are based on and so forth. I didn't know if the committee might want to see a map like that to be able to use the same categories, excuse me, use the same categories, but change the lines on the map related to those UZAs.
And Chair, if I could, I guess I'm going to keep going back to something that Director Mitchell was saying is the small number of projects. So part of it is trying to map the expectation of who would apply for this money, and then so we balance that. So there might be a great amount of validity in going to different categories, but if most of the projects that are going to be of this size are only in 50, like large urbanized areas, that's where I'm mentally having a disconnect, so that we're making sure that we're not getting overly specific on something that may be not relevant. But if most of the projects we're looking at are 5 million or 2 million over or whatever, does that actually occur in areas that are not urbanized areas? Like, I don't know. Or we got enough coverage under the minor enhancement and the state of good repair to cover all of those areas.
I guess I'm just trying to think about how it would change things, I guess, in terms of the weighting. And one of the reasons, I mean, these were somewhat drawn to during the SMART scale process to incorporate the boundaries of PDCs and MPOs, which, you know, also handle a lot of the funding that comes through to projects. And for example, in Hampton Roads, it's actually broken out. The Hampton Roads district is actually broken into a couple pieces to reflect the fact that some of it's very rural and some of it's very urban. So, you know, you can kind of see that there's a red part of Hampton Roads, there's a blue part of Hampton Roads. I do think that we will make it available to MPOs if they do want to request a change, as we said last time, and, you know, be able to evaluate that further, especially in terms of how that happens. If it, you know, the MPO needs to make a specific request to DRPT to change that weighting framework. But what we don't want to have is that, you know, I think once a region, once an MPO picks a category, they need to stay with it too. So it can't change based on the submission.
Wait and see what how the projects do under each of the categories, and then pick the one they want.
The next slide actually gets at that a little bit. I think we had a discussion, well, what impact does it have? And again, this is a very small subset of projects. We should keep that in mind. But the question was, what would happen without weighting versus with weighting? And the bottom line is actually, it has kind of a minor impact on the overall ranking. And one reason for that, we should keep in mind. So you could see with no weighting, we have them ranked 1 through 19, and with weighting, we have 1 through 19. And the top 10 projects are pretty consistent. There's a slight shuffling, but you still come up with kind of the same top 10 and the same sort of bottom 9. Just a little bit of movement within these things. But the question is sort of, well, why? And I think one thing to keep in mind is that if you had no weighting, each thing would be weighted about 17%. Generally, the weights are 15 to 20%. So what we're talking about here are little percentages that when you look at the overall scores, the big things are how much was your benefit score, and then dividing by cost, what was your cost. Those things have a much bigger impact than sort of how much weight we give to any one measure. So, you know, I think I just wanted to bring that up because I know there was a lot of discussion at the last meeting about how critical, you know, these weights may be. And I think you definitely would see a little bit of movement, but it may not have quite the impact. You know, it doesn't completely change the bottom line of sort of which projects emerge at the top.
Isn't this, those who apply for Smart Scale for transit are going to have the tendency to be in your category A's because the projects that they're submitting are going to have the advantage related to congestion versus other typical major expansion projects, like if someone ran a commuter service from an outlying area. So I feel like the Smart Scale, VDOT's Smart Scale program created an incentive for major urban areas to apply their transit projects versus not so urban areas because of just the way the weighing was set up. So we're looking at a set of projects and you know, you take the weighting away and they kind of pan out the same. Well, we don't really quite have a full scope of all potential transit major expansion projects and how they would be impacted by a weighting or not.
I do want to point out, though, is that while we did get a number of applications from Northern Virginia, for example, we actually funded quite a bit outside of Northern Virginia. We funded some projects in Hampton Roads. We funded some projects in Lynchburg, Danville, Roanoke. I think that what we actually saw was that there was a fair amount of geographic diversity for some of the transit projects that did get funded, which surprised and pleased me when I saw that. It wasn't just projects in Northern Virginia. So,
like from one of your earlier slides, that those projects outside of the Northern Virginia area rose to the top when the costs got factored in. The benefits weren't as high, but when the cost came in, it rose up on the list.
yeah, I do want to dispel the myth that there was there was a bias towards just the projects in the urban areas. So,
well, I didn't mean to imply that there was a bias towards it. What I meant is a locality choosing where to seek funding from would gravitate towards Smart Scale if they had a competitive congestion project versus a project that wouldn't have been, and they would have gravitated towards the typical DRPT process. So that's what I meant, is that we're looking at projects that gravitated towards applying for Smart Scale versus looking at future projects that are going to be all types of expansions. I guess, are we going to factor in weighing or not? I guess did that ever get decided?
I mean, my takeaway from the last meeting was that the recommendation of this group was to stick with the Smart Scale rating, with the caveat that if a region really wants to opt out or change their rating, we will entertain a request for that. But I think that it's, and how that works, like I said, how that request happens, we'll have to figure out exactly what the mechanics are for that. But I think that there was a sense, at least, I think from this group, to stick with the weightings that have already been developed through the previous process.
And how that's captured in the policy principles document, that is something that's going to be reexamined, right? That's sort of the first year, 2, 3, and then be a full reexamination in 3 years, I think is what you guys have captured.
And I did take some comfort from seeing this table to see that it doesn't, while it does have some impact on reordering, it's not as dramatic as some people, as we may have felt when we first saw that, so.
Let's ask about the MPO role in this. Are you all, is DRPT going to coordinate with the MPOs to see if they want to adjust these weights, or?
We have been doing outreach already to the MPOs, and in terms of the mechanism for how we will entertain a request, I guess,
And we've talked to all the MPOs now in the Commonwealth about the reform package and the items that we're working on and that TISDAC is working on. We haven't figured out the mechanics of how we would entertain that with the individual MPOs, but we can certainly reach out and do that.
We will, like I said, we were trying to get through this process first, but
Right.
but yeah, I mean, in terms of, we would certainly reach out to them and let them know that if they wanted to submit a request and there's, I mean, I have to caution, and I think that there's room for the MPOs to discuss this and decide if they want to stick with the same type of weighting that they're using for Smart Scale. But I will also say that there was a very extensive process that they participated in for Smart Scale to come up with these ratings, or I mean, this weighting framework that hopefully would have value in transit project selection too. It is also difficult to sometimes explain sort of from the optics standpoint about why a region feels they shouldn't have one factor calculated against another factor more heavily than another factor. But I think that, again, I think that if the MPOs wanted to change their designation, I think that's something we would definitely entertain, so.
I'm not suggesting that
Yeah.
to go there. I just wanted to understand the process, and if it may be as simple as having the MPO policy board just adopt the Smart Scale weighting, right?
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the things that we've looked at since the last meeting is each one of the Smart Scale projects has a scorecard. And so you can go in and look at any one of those projects that was on the list that Tom shared. You can see how each individual factor, each individual measure scored. And you can go in and play with the weightings. And I did that in a couple of regions to say, would it have made a difference? And it really did. I mean, just Tom's graphic was way better than anything I put together, but it didn't move the needle. And I think that's something that the MPOs have been involved in. They've seen. So I'm not sure where they would land, but I think they're well versed in being able to look at that related to transit projects and be able to make a recommendation back to the state.
I think from some of our guiding principles for keeping it simple, the KISS principle, and if they're applying and leveraging, as Jennifer mentioned, if we had different categories and weighting and different mapping, it would make it more confusing to apply for applications. I was trying to cross-reference slide 19 with 16, because we had a lot of good conversation about how accessibility and environment and land use scored well and congestion mitigation didn't. So drew some arrows on the top to cross with 16 to 19 and looking at the weights. So overall transit projects, for example, scored, congestion mitigation didn't weight those, but yet in category A, that's the highest. So, and then land use was high, but in C and D, of course, we're not weighting them. So I was just curious if maybe Tom or Jennifer could comment on any issues you saw from that when you combine those two slides.
I think land use one in particular, as you saw, there were a lot of projects submitted from category A, meaning Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, that were submitted for smart scale funding. They included the land use measure. They did pretty well in that area. So, but again, the congestion gets a little more weight in category A, but they were picking up disproportionately more points in accessibility and land use. Again, this is kind of hard because the projects that applied for smart scale is kind of a self-selecting group, and we only picked up 19 of them, and we're not sure exactly which projects we'll get for this. So this is just meant, I think, when we looked at it, it was meant more to be a guide of how certain measures would do. But again, if we change the congestion measure to be focused primarily on ridership potential, I think that gives you a sense of which projects will do well.
Thank you. I just kind of wanted to talk through that connection because we are being more transit oriented in the measures as well as keeping to the weights.
I think you raise a good point. The biggest difference with weighting is that categories C and D do not use the land use measure. So I think that's probably the biggest impact of the smart scale weighting scheme.
And that's actually in law. I mean, is it, yeah. So.
So in terms of next steps, what we want to do today is to kind of wrap up that we're headed in the right direction with the evaluation measures. Next week, Jennifer's going to present a summary of where we are to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. We'll be spending time over the next month with Tom and Nate and the consultant team to develop the details of the scoring methodology, keeping in mind that we've got to put this into a format that we can then roll out to transit agencies around the Commonwealth. We have to build the technology behind the scenes, but also the forward-facing application for those agencies to use. We'll have to get that out on the street no later than November 1st. So we've got a lot of work to do behind the scenes in the next month or so. At the same time, we'll be putting together that draft policy for the CTB to bring back to you for your meeting on September the 7th. We did schedule an intermediate webinar that's the week prior. I'm looking at Courtney. The end of August. That is intended to push out information to you on the operating formula and on another provision of the budget language that has to do with major equipment leasing programs, and it's really just to share information, but not to go back into the prioritization at that time. We'll do that in the September 7th meeting that'll be back here in Richmond.
So can I ask that we do this? Brian Smith spent some time consulting with others and putting together a presentation. I'd just like to go through a couple of the points that he put out there. I know that the other members didn't have the opportunity to review this, so maybe if I can clumsily try to
You can pull up the presentation. We have it electronically up there. So.
Right. Just want to highlight a couple of points that I think were central to his discussion. And to begin, just to remind everybody the magnitude of the funding that we're talking about here, which is to say that we are talking about a relatively small amount of funding for major expansion projects that we're looking at a maximum of 20% of the available capital funding, which is about $7 to $8 million annually. Is that that's about right, I think, right? So obviously that full 20% would not be utilized if we were in need of greater funding for state of good repair. But that's about where we're looking at, which means that there are not going to be huge projects that are going to be funded out of this. And it may be, I think we've talked before about the possibility this could be a way of leveraging additional funds or planning the means by which those major projects are going to eventually be accomplished, doing some of the advanced groundwork. But to move on to Brian Smith's points, he would express concern about the availability of funding in Northern Virginia in particular because of some dedicated transit funding that is available. I guess I would just like to know how you all would respond to his concern over that question, that if we are going to credit the ability to bring other funds to the table, does that discriminate against other regions of the state in any meaningful way?
To be clear, we're not awarding extra points for somebody that has additional funding sources. It's just that we're dividing by the cost that they're the amount of funding that they're requesting from the capital program. And just as a matter of background, this was discussed just ad nauseum, I think, at CTB and during the smart scale process. Coming up. It's still coming up. And I think that the sense from the CTB has been, at least, and I don't want to speak for them, but that we do want the purpose of the prioritization process is to identify the projects where we are getting the most bang for the state's buck. And so that really is, and I think that's a similar goal that the General Assembly has identified for the transit program as well, is to look at the projects that we are getting the most benefit for the amount, each dollar of transit capital funding that's going to them. We do provide to the CTB both the raw benefit scores as well as the cost effectiveness. And I actually don't like the term cost effectiveness because that means something but the benefit divided by the amount of funds that are required. We do provide that information to the CTB so that at any point, if the CTB wants to pick a project that has a really, really high benefit rating, even though it didn't, because the benefits were so good, even though the project may have scored a little bit lower when you divided that by cost, the CTB can do that. And I would imagine that that would be the same here as well. So,
Can I ask you a question? I guess Northern Virginia. Okay.
That we actually don't have dedicated funding for these sources. WMATA is out of this. So there's some clarification. Our local systems are just like the local systems around the state. Any dedicated funding has actually been removed from another source of funding that could be used by our transit agencies, which the authority funds. So I want to make sure there's no confusion at all. There is no, but for actually, I should say, VRE was able to get some regional gas tax money that can be used as a dedicated funding. But Northern Virginia, the transit systems that are now able to apply for these DRPT funds do not have a dedicated funding source for transit. And they have access to less Northern Virginia regional money as a result of the transit bill. I just want to make sure that's very, very clear, because I don't want there to be any misunderstanding that there's dedicated funding for our other transit operators in Northern Virginia.
And am I correct that in Northern Virginia, the availability of federal funding is more limited in terms of these capital projects as well, compared to other?
They could apply, for example, for new starts or something like that. Most of the Northern Virginia providers, except for PRTC and VRE, do not take federal funding. They make that attributable towards their metro contribution. So it allows to reduce the local burden on the metro bill. So it's nuanced and a little complicated, but as I say, our Northern Virginia transit providers are very similar boat as the providers around the state, and perhaps even in a tougher spot as a result of some of the carve-outs of funding done this year at the legislature. So.
Could I make a point here? And this is speaking from the perspective of one who had responsibilities statewide for a certain area, I hope we're not getting into a point where we're, in essence, pitting one part of the state against the other. The bigger overall issue here is we need more funding for transit across the state, and that to have limited amounts of funding available and then have parts of the state fight one another for it, I think is just absolutely, totally ridiculous. And that we ought to keep focused on the bigger picture of needing more funding for transit in Northern Virginia because it's needed, other parts of the state because they have needs as well, and that gets us back to the whole question of overall transit funding. I just don't want to get into that of one versus the other, to be honest with you.
Right, and I just want to make sure that we answer the issues that have been raised by a member of the
I understand, and I thought I was trying to answer it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay.
And just as a final point on this question about other funding, we do have an expectation that localities are going to provide some funding. It's a relatively modest amount, and then that in many instances they are eligible to draw down a significant amount of federal funding to support many of these projects as well. So, okay.
We also see projects that leverage other funding that's available through MPOs like Regional Surface Transportation Program funds and Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality that are available in Hampton Roads, Richmond, and Northern Virginia.
A second issue that I picked up out of the discussion was a concern that redirecting existing resources to sort of reorganize the service provision within a locality could be might run the risk of being categorized as a major expansion. And my sense was that that was relying on a definition provided by the FTA, but that really doesn't fall into what we've been talking about in terms of what are major expansions, because it wouldn't involve increasing the numbers of vehicles or routes. It would be redirecting resources within the existing system. Is that correct? Or?
This one, and Mr. Dillard isn't in the room right now, so we can't ask him for clarification, but this one was a little bit confusing to me because when you talk about service modifications that remain within the existing system, service hours, miles, fleet size, Richmond and GRTC have just gone through that process, and all of that is done within things that would be considered state of good repair or minor enhancement. So I don't know what they are envisioning, but this whole significant change in FTA guidelines is not something that we've talked about relative to prioritization.
Yeah, our definitions have nothing to do with how FTA defines a significant change. You know, I was a little confused by this too, but I think the, you know, if we were talking about would this entail like perhaps a maintenance facility if a region were to redo their bus routes and decided that as a result they needed to locate a maintenance facility in a part of their service area that didn't exist. I mean, to me, if it's actually creating the ability to have more efficient service or more increased frequencies, we've actually developed within this methodology some criteria that can account for that. If it truly is a state of, you know, it's replacing existing capacity, for example, then it would fall under state of good repair and minor enhancement. So I think it's, again, I'm not sure. I think we'd have to see a project when it came in to really make a determination about whether or not it's one or the other.
I'm LJ Hansen with Suffolk Transit. I didn't write the document here, but if I can add a little bit of clarification, I'd be happy to. I think you hit the nail right on the head. The FTA does designate what a major project is or a significant project. I think that when this item was brought up, the concern was if there was a major reorganization, would we consider the fact that there was service already in place, or would we discount that and say, no, that doesn't count anymore, this is all new service, whatever you're getting rid of. And I think that was the concern. Is it the delta, the difference, the new service? Would that allow, if it's under the $2 million threshold, would that be a minor enhancement? I think that was the concern that was brought to the table, at least on the first bullet.
So I think it would be useful for the minutes to reflect the fact that we are not relying on that FTA definition as binding on the determinations for these funds.
And with regard to the second bullet, I can probably speak a little bit more clearly on that. Suffolk Transit, that probably relates a lot to comments that we had. We don't currently have any facilities. We're an expansion system, very young system. We don't have any facilities. The question is if, and I saw a lot today with regard to the presentation that you made, Tom. I think that that's been addressed, but the question there was if it's a facility to address an existing support that's already in place, again, we don't have anything. So anything that we put in place would be, is it an expansion or is it a state of good repair if it passes the $2 million threshold? And I think that's the point of the second bullet. So,
okay, thank you. And I know that's a concern in the bus system that serves my area as well, because the facilities are very important, and the question is how are they going to be calculated. I was reassured that by virtue of the way in which the facilities are being measured in terms of their impact, that they would probably compete well.
And again, I think it may be something that rather than trying to create a rule that we apply across the board, at this point in time, that it makes more sense to kind of deal with these on a case-by-case basis as grantees come in and to work with them to understand, is this actually expanding service, or is it something that is, you know, creating a, you know, essentially it's a replacement or a state of good repair need. I don't know, for example, how that would apply for Suffolk, but we'd be happy to work with you. And also, I don't want to assume that they wouldn't compete well under this, actually. I mean, we've developed some criteria that are designed to capture increased service efficiency from projects like that. So,
and at the risk of getting back to the point that Mr. Dyke very appropriately expressed concern about, there was a suggestion that a limit be placed on regional share of funding for this project in a given year to 65% for one region, no more than 95% to any two regions. the indications are that regions are competing fairly well at this point. Obviously, if that's not the case in future years, that would be something that we would need to examine. But
Really afraid of unintended consequences, honestly, by dictating something versus what's coming in.
Right. So, but again, I raise this as just to try to make sure that the committee knows the points that were raised and takes them into account.
But I think, once again, it's an opportunity for us to make a statement that overall transit funding has to be increased in the state, and that we ought not get away from repeating that every opportunity we have.
Chair, if I could add to both those two comments and the earlier one, I think it's very valuable to walk these through, so make sure we're responsive to our public comments. The unintended consequence I would be afraid of with this is, one, it adds complexity for calculation, and it could leave money on the table because we've reached a threshold at a certain region, and to benefit statewide, I think, at least at this point, I would support the comments.
And our applications are very lumpy, you know, we don't get the same mix every year from regions, and so it's not like, for example, formula dollars that, you know, are used on the highway side, where there's, you know, they spread everything around, or part of the funds around, based on a regional allocation formula. I think in this case, a lot of these needs are very cyclical, and they don't always come in at the same time from every region, so I would worry about unintended consequences too. I think if we get through this and start to see that there's a geographic bias, I think we would need to revisit that. But it's imposing a rule would concern me. So.
Then the final point that I would draw out of Mr. Smith's comments suggested that our cost effectiveness measures were, our congestion mitigation measures were not the appropriate ones to utilize, and in particular, the way in which we were measuring cost effectiveness. I think, is that right, Tom? Did you had an opportunity to review his comments?
I would say we actually are proposing a person throughput measure that very much matches what's described here in terms of it being based on the number of potential users. I think what we also proposed was to not have the delay component. That's the second part of this. But I think if you take a look at what's laid out here, I think that's pretty much, you know, what I presented for congestion mitigation.
Again, I'd encourage everybody to review that material, but I think we've got some ability to, at least from a fairly high level, make some comments related to our policies.
If I could just add, I thank you for forwarding the PowerPoint. That was helpful to go back and relook at it as we talked and put it back up. But I think you also have what looks like a Word document with a chart. And just to make sure that all of TESDEC have it, I would request that we have that forwarded as well.
Or is that the, which document is that?
We've got paper copies of that coming over with lunch. So
January 26th, the memo from Brian Smith to
June 26th. Oh, okay, that is the one.
June 26th.
And it's actually almost verbatim what's in his presentation.
Right.
Literally, I think he cut and pasted some of the text in there. So what you have really should reflect the same comments. We can still forward it. And I don't think, as Jen mentioned, we saw it. We took another look at it last night, and at the time, I think he only copied me, John, Jen, and then I think some of the folks that he's been working with in Hampton Roads on these comments. I don't think we realized that they hadn't gone to the full TSDAC until we looked at it last night. But then when I looked at the presentation, I said, oh, it's the same exact thing that's in the presentation. So
we'll just close the loop because.
But we will still send it out, yes, absolutely.
So Chair, is this the time, so there was, at least for me, I noticed 2 of the criteria where we wanted them to do a little bit tweaking or whatever. Is this the time to sort of state those things, or does that happen after lunch, or?
I think we can do that now. I think we got some time.
We've already talked about them, but I just wanted to make sure that for environmental quality, that indeed that there is some recognition of green, either energy efficient or emission controlling, or both, in infrastructure and fleets, that there's some recognition of that. Again, I don't know what that plays out. And the other one was, again, how we deal with the land use thing, and is, land use policies, are they're existing TOD policies or planned TOD policies or something like that, so you can actually get both of those. So those are the two I just want to make sure we don't forget about.
For one of the things that comes to mind for me is, the FTA process for new starts has a qualitative factor of the availability of transit supportive land use plan, or it's
policies and
existing policies and procedures that have resulted in transit-oriented development. And so, that's one of several factors that FTA uses in addition to, when they're evaluating projects. But that is one thing we could consider adding to this as a sort of 50-50 weight or something like that, where we could take into account, again, a qualitative measure that that identifies an area that has already taken steps to increase TOD. That I think we may need to be careful that it doesn't overlap too much with the accessibility factor that also accounts for existing density. But I mean, that's one thing, just off the top of my head, that I can think of that we could.
Accessibility to jobs versus, because TOD is not just about employment. It could be about schools. It could be about hospitals. Well, just employment, but
housing
and all those sorts of things. So that's, if there's I don't know. It's tough because they do overlap.
But that's one thing we could consider, is doing something similar to what FTA uses for new starts, which is, again, this existence of, I don't know, Tom, if you know better than, or anybody else in the room knows better, but they do have a factor that, and they rate it on a sort of a scale of 1 to 5 for the existence of
policies and plans that support.
Yeah, exactly. Transit supportive land use policies. Yeah.
In addition to the points that Kate raised, I think we had a good discussion on economic development to make sure that we are capturing redevelopment and the workforce. So I'll just pull those from my notes. And for congestion mitigation, we had a healthy discussion on sort of when do we count ridership.
We'll have to figure out what the appropriate forecast year would be.
forecasting.
And the forecast year may differ based on whether it's a fixed guideway project, for example, compared to somebody who's expanding their fleet size. And obviously, we wouldn't want to look at 20 years out for that, but it may be something where we should look at opening year plus, some for major, for a major corridor project, we'd look at future as well. I think for, it's been a while since I looked.
FTA actually averages them.
That's right. That's what I was going to say. FTA, I think, actually averages those. So, yep.
Just maybe I'm the only one, but we've been using Smart Scale quite a bit around the state, and people are submitting new Smart Scale Round 3 applications now, or at least they're fine-tuning them. Can we call this something else that distinguishes what it is? I mean, I don't want people to get confused, because we get a lot of blowback from regions about the complexities already involved in this, and I just don't want us to, I'd like for us to mitigate the confusion as much as possible.
One of the things we talked about early on that I think we haven't really tackled yet was branding this entire thing and how best to brand it as transit reforms, and I think we still need to do a little bit of work with that to come up with something that's identifiable as the transit program's prioritization process as opposed to Smart Scale.
And if I could just, sort of going from that, we keep going back to Smart Scale, and this is new and different. And so we also need to sort of divorce ourselves. That's great, we've done all this analysis, but now we're looking at new criteria that are about person throughput, not about delay. As soon as we can get to that branding or something and show how this is distinct and very special for transit, I think will be really helpful even for my own brain.
Non-marketing concept that we came up with in the office was MERIT, and it is an acronym, for making efficient and responsible investments in transit. So we're working on, so we're working on a graphic. Yeah, we put a little contest, and there were a lot of suggestions. Some of them really, really good, and some of them were really funny. But that one's one, we had a couple that were really good that kind of captured what we were trying to achieve. And so we're trying to put together a logo, but we are not graphic designers, and anyway.
I think we're open to suggestions
We're
as well.
open to suggestions.
In Williamsburg, the Chamber of Commerce decided to rename a food festival the Williamsburg Tasting Festival.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Or you could go with IHOP. Actually, it's a branding thing. I heard coming down here today. They're not changing their name.
Oh, really?
It was basically just a branding, marketing opportunity to focus attention on the place, but branding is everything. Drink a new Coke.
All right. Okay. Well, are we at a good point now to take our break? And is
I
this,
believe lunch is here, primarily because Courtney's run out of the room with the keys.
we can move on to the next section if
No,
you'd like.
I actually think if we want to break and give us 5 minutes to get everything set up,
Okay.
and then we can reconvene.
What time, shall we take some time to?
Can I ask a question? How much more do we have to talk about? I mean, should we
the
just keep
policy
rolling?
Principles.
The principles?
We have
how
the
long?
policy principles are what we have left to talk about. And public comment, again, if,
Like a 5-minute break if I can.
But I don't know that it's, yeah.
I would maybe a short break and then do a working lunch. I don't want to shortchange the policy.
Oh, yeah, no, that's all I
but-
was suggesting.
But I would like to
Maybe we
keep
should just kind
moving.
of work.
We had scheduled at least or expected that we would reconvene for lunch at 12:30. I don't know if that's too much time, but if we want to establish for anybody who's listening on the phone or anything like that about what time we would actually,
Yeah, shall we say
reconvene.
12:30, just give everybody a chance to kind of stretch their legs, get things together, and then I suspect that we will be finished before our scheduled time.
I think so too, yeah. Yeah.
Okay? All right, well, let's go ahead and adjourn then.
We'll touch the steering.
Session, and we're moving right through our agenda, and our next item is number 6, which is the summary of key policy principles and development of draft CTB policy. And I assume Jen DeBrule will be leading us through that.
We sent out in your packets, we actually sent 2 things out in the packets. Last time, I believe it was Brian Smith mentioned that, TSDAC had adopted some guiding principles back when we were working on the Revenue Advisory Board report. So I went back, pulled that out, sent that to you. We have, I believe we have stayed within the spirit of those guiding principles, whether we've gone back and looked at them over the last few months or not. With that being said, we provided a draft or an initial set of some, summarizing kind of the discussion of the TSDAC at last month's meeting, and then went back and made edits to that document based on last month's discussion, which we sent to you in the form of track changes. So looking for feedback on those, and because that's going to be the basis of us putting together a CTB policy.
The guiding principles are simply a document for our internal use, so it's not going on themselves, but it is a great reminder to have these agreed upon principles.
It's a great reminder that intentionally or unintentionally we have remained on the same course that we set 2 years ago.
Absolutely intentional.
Ask a question about paratransit vehicles. Can that also be services, or how do you count?
I think it can be services. Last month, Brian Smith, I think it was Brian Smith, brought up a question about paratransit vehicles because we've seen a lot of growth in demand for that element of service around the state, really around the country. One of the things that I think that I mentioned last month is there may be different ways of providing that service or meeting that increased demand. Through technology or through other partnerships or providers. So I think we need to make sure that we've accounted for that as well. But I do think the concern from HRT, and we saw this in grant applications from them in this current fiscal year, is that they have an increasing need that goes beyond that 5% threshold that we set for minor enhancement. And so this was intended to provide a little bit of flexibility because they are mandated to provide that service.
I think that was the big difference, was because it's service that essentially is required by law, and it doesn't meet is the same type of criteria that we would look at for another expansion project, like land use and economic development and accessibility, so that it seemed to make more sense to use similar criteria that we would for minor expansion.
I understand, but I understand there's also, we met with this company that outsources the service. If I wanted to buy the service, does this include that?
I think that'd be covered in our operating funding.
Okay.
Yeah, that right now, really where service is contracted out, that would be really captured in our operating funds through, the payments that they make to a private operator. That does it.
Where we might be able to capture that is in our strategic planning when we outline how they look at the efficiency of how they provide service. We can put some language in those guidelines to encourage them to look at innovation, technology, partnerships that could help them provide service in a more efficient manner. And I think that then, that planning process is intended to then feed the application process to make sure that, the right types of projects are coming forward to meet the needs, and then they ultimately will score well.
Thank you.
And if I could, I did have a request perhaps for some clarification language just on a couple lines above that. So I don't know if we're just going straight through the document, but the minor enhancement, we've said this a lot, talking about that they'd be less than $2 million in total cost, less than 5% increase in total fleet, or no more than 5 expansion vehicles, just to keep folks. Is it the greater? Is it the less? Is it just to make sure, especially when I've got folks with larger fleet size, I just want to make sure we really are clear about what that statement is saying. If it's anything more than 5% or more than 5% or 5% increase or 5 vehicles and 5% increase, whichever is the larger, I think is what we're trying to say, but Okay, I just want to, I think
Well,
that's
no, I
helpful.
think that's a great point.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we
Just
all
so
understand.
there's no question about it.
Right.
Because I keep getting that question asked in our region. Is it whichever is the larger, is that the?
Trying to remember, it's different when you move things from slides to sentences.
Right.
I'm going to look at,
Is it larger, not small? I'm having a
Yeah.
double negative brain moment here. Okay. It does make sense. We just hadn't said it, and folks keep asking the questions, so I figured that means we need to clarify it. And also, just within this section alone, is this where we should be talking about clarifying the issue that one of the ones that Hampton Roads folks brought up, which is clarifying that if you're putting a facility for existing services, that would be considered state of good repair? I don't know if that's the place we'd put something like that.
Again, I think we can acknowledge in these, that that's something we've talked about. I really do feel like that's something that needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. It's hard for me at least, to imagine a rule to say all facilities should be covered as a minor expansion, because there will be cases when a facility is actually designed to expand and enhance service. So I do think that there's, we may have to, we can acknowledge at least that there was some discussion around facilities when the service footprint hasn't changed, but they're designed to improve efficiency, that, we'll have to look at those on a case-by-case basis.
I think the concern from Hampton Roads is they're embarking on a review of their service and looking at how the different providers in the region fit together, what's the right footprint and structure of their service. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty in that, but that's going to take a couple of years to go through that process. So I think there are a lot of what-if questions right now, but it's really going to be a couple of years before we see what the outcome of that is going to be in terms of any kind of grant applications or changes. So
I guess my suggestion was that we just make sure that we minute the fact that we are not relying on the FTA definition.
Right.
Right.
I just didn't know if that was sort of a gimme to just,
Yeah.
but that's fine if you don't need to put it in there. That's all I have.
Okay. Suggestions? Do we want to go through each section quickly, or do you feel like we're satisfied with what you've got in front of you? Okay. You got more? Go ahead, Kate.
Just moving to the second page, I think it's fantastic that we've recognized the midlife overhauls. I think how those are scored or how that actually works, it gets a little bit in the details, but when somebody applies for a midlife overhaul for SGR, but then we're looking at age and condition of asset as 50% of 80% of the scoring or whatever, just sort of how that works. And I want to be mindful of, we've said that midlife overhauls are good. We've also recognized that they're cost effective, although cost effective doesn't came, but how we actually score them is I'm a little struck on. So just want to put that out there.
that's something that we can clarify. We're working with Cambridge next week on kind of how Trans Am fits into the application process, how we could score those types of assets, and that's something that we can certainly address in the application guidance, because the CTB policy is setting the framework. This is where the major policy principles and the structure of how prioritization is going to work is going to be outlined, but there's going to be additional, we have a program application guidance document that's going to need to be revised and appended to. So all of that stuff that's already out there still applies. So we're evaluating those today. So we just have to fit that, marry those two documents together.
One other thing, which is really a little bit of a wording thing that struck me, the last sub-bullet there says, points will be awarded based on age and mileage at the time of application until the SGR backlog is reduced. And that it just kind of jumped out at me. I think we'd all love to see the state of good repair backlog to be like reduced, but that's having that statement at the end sort of threw me off a little bit. As if we're going to all of a sudden miracles are miracles and things are going to get thrown out. So I just thought that until the SGR backlog is reduced was a little, I don't know, problematic to have it there. So I don't know.
I've kind of I think I rewrote this bullet like 3 or 4 times, and I'm sure that it's been edited by different folks that have reviewed it since then, is trying to capture the discussion that we had where right now we have vehicles in the system. I was looking at an inventory for a transit agency yesterday that has vehicles in the system that are revenue vehicles that are buses that are 20 years old. All right, so that's like well beyond anything that's considered to be state of good repair. So we have things like that. And so until those get out of the system, we're just kind of looking at where things are. But we talked about as a group getting to the point where we're predicting, you know, it takes 2 years to get to order and get a replacement vehicle. So how do we, right now we've got kind of this backlog of vehicles that are beyond that useful life benchmark. How do we get away from that and get towards the replacement just-in-time predictive model? Those two things I don't think fit together. I haven't gotten it straight in my own head. So the wording, if you guys have got a suggestion of better how better to capture that, but I think right now it's hard to incorporate predictive when you've still got assets in the system that are really, really out of.
I think just like what you talked about with other things is the idea that this is what's happening, being proposed now for the next couple of years. So we're re-examining those things moving forward and recognizing this is another area that would be re-examined as the backlog is reduced, might be fine, but that is all I have, Chair.
Just on that last point, maybe I'm not understanding it entirely. At some point, would we not use those factors?
Still, we're always going to use age and mileage. I think it's how you calculate the points, and are you calculating the points based on what the age and mileage of that vehicle is right now when you apply, or are you predicting that it's going to take 2 years to get that replacement vehicle? So what would the age and the mileage be at the time that that vehicle will be replaced with the funding that's being requested?
Was the keyword of application.
Right.
We can calculate. Help is on the way. We can calculate that.
Well, I think part of the discussion was, right now it's highest points based on oldest, but I think part of our discussion was, is there a point at which, when you're at a steady state, you might reward more points for being right at where you need to be replacement-wise? But I think from that discussion, the feeling was, at this point, we're still giving the highest points to the oldest assets. And I think that's maybe what that point was getting at.
I think just from an application standpoint, I don't think it needs to be written out, but distinguishing difference between the points that are awarded and the project actually being accepted, because all awarding points at the time of application keeps the playing field even, but if a recipient needs a vehicle that they project they'll need in a year because they'll reach those thresholds, and that's a different application aspect, because that's where DRPT looks in and says, this vehicle has not reached those miles yet for the threshold to replace them, but they will in a year. So I don't think that needs to be addressed, but I just wanted to say it because I think there's a distinguishing difference between awarding points and actually being granted that the application is valid. Mm-hmm. It's eligible. Yeah, it's eligible. That's the word.
And we look at that now in terms of eligibility. We're not awarding points, but we're looking at things like that, you know, in our existing process.
Chair, I think kind of following on this wording thing, this is the principle, so it's one place where we kind of document what we're doing now and what we might do later. So I appreciate trying to have a short bullet point that talks about it until the backlog is reduced, but I'm not sure I have a solution yet. But I don't feel like that captures the discussion and the point you just shared, Jennifer, in terms of predictive and changing the weighting that Tom just referenced. And it doesn't highlight the at the time of application. That almost needs to be sooner, because that's the key point right now. So I think I would request that we do revisit how to word this one, but maybe we can all look at it and see if we can have something that makes more sense to us and help out DRPT summarize a whole lot in a sentence.
Else have any comments, suggested revisions? So I guess the question is this, other than those couple of points that we've identified, need any further revision?
I guess one, it's stated in our guiding principles about DRPT staff with technical capacity, providing technical capacity. Does it need to be in here that, this is going to put an additional demand on DRPT staffing? I've mentioned that a couple of times before. I don't know if that needs to go into the policy principles. I don't know how it would go in there, but it somehow needs to be recognized that you can't do the additional work with the existing resources you have in your office right now. At least I don't think you can. I don't know how that would get.
Well, I think what we can, before getting into resources, I think that at least acknowledging, we can make sure we include something that talks about what DRPT will do to help these applications and in performing the analysis required for this versus what we would expect applicants to do at the time of application. And I think also the point that for any, for major expansion projects, we may need to develop a different application cycle so that gives us more time to evaluate and to actually do that analysis. So
it might be, Cindy's mentioned it before, about if a locality doesn't have the capacity or the transit system to do certain functions, then DRPT would step in and help. Maybe that's the approach that y'all take, is that if, you know, if needed.
In the way that SmartScale is done right now is VDOT does all of it, and or OIPI does all of it. And so it's, I mean, the applicants obviously submit a lot of information, but in terms of the modeling that's performed and some of the accessibility modeling, it's done by VDOT or OIPI staff. I guess with this process, I don't know if that's something that we want to just take on all of it, or just say that there's certain things that, such as the accessibility measure, that have a more technical component that we are able to perform at the request of a grantee, or we could offer to do it all the time for every project.
It feels like for transparency and just clarity, it would be nice to have a DRPT role or a category and clarify some of those points. Sure. That's at least what we're recommending DRPT and the CTB consider. And then I had one other thing, Chair, when we're ready to come off of that one. And we'll just change topics on you. We had a good discussion on the weighting, and I'm wondering if we should reference some of that weighting in here, specifically what we're going to follow. Because on the page 2, we have where they have an opportunity to validate their weighting. So I think that's the change discussion we were talking about earlier, but it seems to like pop in without us actually saying what is the principle of weighting we're going to follow.
I do hope, and I think this is what you're getting at, is all the conversations, of course, we had about major expansion are going to find themselves in here. And so we need to make sure we capture that too, right? Yeah.
To touch base on Brad's point that there's some things in the principles that might be valuable to have in the principles too. I'm thinking just some of the integrity of the system, the accountability, transparency, a bit of sort of the goals and the purpose is an important piece. And we've talked throughout the day about trying to keep it simple and not complicate, because we want to leverage everybody applying for multiple funding sources. So if they're doing the SmartScale and the new Merit rebranded system, or whatever we call it, and we do RSTP and CMAQ, I would value having that kind of as a principle in here.
Sure.
Any other comments?
Not a comment, but a question. Is this document going to be the basis of your presentation to the CTB, or when will this go back to CTB? And in that, is there a sequence where we'll see it again?
Sure. So what we, this is not necessarily the basis of the CTB presentation. It's, which I'll have to check. I'm not sure if it's posted online yet, but it's, it actually includes a lot of the information that Tom has presented on the measures, and it goes into some more specific details. And it's just an informational briefing for CTB. We will then also take the, this document, that's the the policy principles document, and start to convert that into something that would go to CTB for their approval. So this is really just making sure we've got the right points in here and the right points of agreement so far. So
Slides have not been posted yet. There includes the measure slides that we talked about today, and we didn't want it to be posted because we wanted the opportunity to make changes if changes were needed to reflect today's discussion. So all the slides in there you have seen in one capacity or another. They've been cobbled together by other presentations and materials that have been provided to TSDAC previously.
So with that, Chair, when would be the expectation that we see the next version? And I'm assuming there's a TSDAC vote or consensus on this document?
Well, I guess what I'd like is to see whether there is general agreement on acceptance of these principles with the revisions that have been talked about. And then I would assume that we would consider this at our September 7th meeting? September 7th?
I'm looking at Jen I'm not sure exactly what to commit in terms of a date for turning this back around, but.
We can turn this back around and send it out to you with the draft minutes, maybe by the end of, I'm looking at Courtney now, by the end of the month. So we can get this piece back out to you. And then you can give us feedback if there's edits. We can do that kind of informally. We've got to be very careful with FOIA, and we can't do a whole lot via email, but we'll send it out as a draft and offer the opportunity for folks to send changes in if there's something that you want to edit. When we come back to you in September, it's going to be with a draft CTB policy that we'll get out to you a couple weeks in advance. So it will not be back to this list, but it will be talking about how this translates into a policy. I mean, with all the whereas clauses and all that good stuff.
Do you want us to adopt something like this as the committee?
I think that's up to the discretion of TSDAC. It's helpful for us to be able to, if this generally captures this in the presentation from today, generally captures the sense of TSDAC, it gives us a place to go with the board presentation. But we're simply running out of time to kind of come back and get TSDAC to affirm this in a meeting format before we move on with CTB policy.
Being sensitive to FOIA, the August meeting with the webinar, that's publicly noticed. It's generally informational, but are we precluded from taking a consensus vote on another version?
I would urge us to, I mean, really we wanted to keep that as an informational, as a way for us to push information out, just because the webinar format is so difficult from in terms of an opportunity to debate and discuss and have more of a getting input from you all. So it was really intended to be just informational for us to push information out to you, along with any, and we'll make sure it's all publicly noticed as well, so other members of the public can participate too.
I'm not suggesting, by the way, that we have reopen the discussion of this. I'm really thinking that if we are satisfied with the draft here today, then we can go ahead and just put this on the agenda for ratification at the next meeting.
And what we'll have in September, though, is going to be it's going to basically take this and then flush it out with whereas clauses and things like that goes into a lot more background. Right. So that's what you'll see a couple weeks ahead of time before September, and I think September is where we would like to get your concurrence with that document, because that's when we will be going to this. We'll be going to the CTB 2 weeks after that.
So, Mr. Dyke, do you want to make that a motion?
I move that we indicate that we are in agreement with what we have in front of us now, and that
with the amendments.
With the amendments, and that you use this as the basis for presenting us with the draft resolution to vote on September 7th.
Okay.
Second.
We do have discussion if you have a second. I just want to clarify that has the specific things we just talked about, including, as Kate mentioned earlier, all of our discussion through the presentation, because there were some other things on weighting and scoring that I would want to make sure we capture as principles.
Get that revised version that captures all that out to you along with the minutes by the end of the month.
And we'll separately get those resolutions, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I think based on this conversation and the motion that we're approving the consensus with the amendments, I feel comfortable with that, knowing in September we'll actually vote on the resolution. I would not feel comfortable voting to adopt something that is in such draft because we had such a good conversation today.
Anybody else have comments or concerns? If not, we'll call the question, and all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none? Abstain? Okay. Then it's passed unanimously. Okay. So now, did you, I think we've covered the two items in this number 6, is that right? So we're now back to next steps summary?
To summarize, and some of this is me keeping all of this straight in my own head because there's
Yeah,
lots
we're
of
listening.
moving parts and pieces. So we come back together late August. Okay, so let me add the item that we just talked about. So we'll get you the draft minutes from this meeting and the revised policy principles before the end of this month, so by August 1st. We will come back together, have a TISDAC webinar end of August. I think it's the 28th. Somewhere around this last week in August. That's going to be informational on the operating formula and on the major equipment leasing program. Just getting you prepped for the September meeting. September 7th, we'll be meeting. Our plan right now is to hold that meeting in our office. So you'll get to come to our space. On the 7th, we'll live stream. We'll have everything set up the way we do here, just a little bit different setting. That meeting is going to be focused on the draft CTB policy, and then we'll also start working on the operating formula as well. Then 2 weeks later, we go to the CTB. We give them a briefing on the draft CTB policy. So after the TISDAC meeting on the 7th, we'll have to release that draft policy for public comment. So it's got to be out on the street for at least 45 days. So we'll get that out after the TISDAC meeting for public comment. It'll be properly noticed and made available for the TISDAC meeting as well, so it'll actually be out longer. But we want to incorporate any revisions from the TISDAC. Brief the CTB 2 weeks later. CTB meeting in October has been pushed back. It's at the end of the month. I think it's the 29th and 30th to line up with the Governor's Innovation Conference. So we have a little bit of extra time to get everything ready for the CTB. It does crunch us a little bit on our communications and outreach to our grantees because we have to have outreach meetings and educate folks to get ready for applications that'll start, that period will open up December 1st. So once we get through this piece, which is prioritization, but it's also the strategic planning element because we have to have that done by October as well. We need to ramp up on operating formula, so we'll start talking about that in September. We'll need to schedule meetings in October and November on operating formula. We'll brief the CTB on operating formula initially in December. We will take a draft formula or draft policy on operating assistance back to the CTB in January for action in February. So, hope you like seeing us because we're going to be together a lot.
If possible, I do have a question about the operating, just so we all understand. Obviously, we had a lot of debate for years about the prioritization stuff. Tell me how much flexibility or how much discussion, debate, and changes will this body be able to have within the conversation about operating assistance? There are words in the law. I just want to make sure we understand what flexibilities or not exist and what you'll be looking to this body for.
Not quite sure how to answer that right now. I mean, it's, you know, we're still working on a kind of a draft proposal to bring as a starting point to bring back to you all. But are you talking about wanting to start from scratch?
No, I just want to know, I just really want to know what's sort of what the game's going to look like. If that is, there are words about using service delivery factors. Are you re-examining what those are? Or is there, I just want to kind of know what to prep, because that's going to happen real fast. And I know that has had huge debate in previous years. So I just want to make sure that we're mentally prepared to where this may be going. So we can be responsive, right?
There's language in the bill, and this, I mean, in the legislation that goes back to the initial TISD Act that says any changes to the service delivery factors have to have a long time of debate and public notice. I think it's a year. So I think we've debated a little bit about what does that mean, but that's written into the legislation that if you're going to modify service delivery factors, you have to have this period of open engagement that honestly from the time the law went into effect, there wasn't enough time to do that.
So are you saying that there won't be time for debate? Or that's, I mean, part of it is there actually a debate, or it's like, this is what it is?
I think there's
Well, I mean, frankly, we really wanted to start in August to say, because a lot of the people here really don't know what the operating factors are. And so that's part of why that August webinar is important for, you know, the new members here who haven't been involved in this to first of all even understand what we do today before now talking about utilizing other factors. And so I think that's why I'm struggling to answer that right now.
Well, I'm delighted.
Yeah.
Somehow I had the impression that this was already baked, done, and there wouldn't be a debate. The fact that there will be is fantastic, and I'm really glad to be engaged in that. So I look forward to see what you guys put together.
But like I said, I recognize we have at least 4 new members who weren't engaged in the earlier process and really don't. Oh, yeah, but well, you were still around when the original process. But I mean,
It's a very short memories.
exactly. So I mean, really, we need to start with just getting everybody up to the same level of understanding about what is done today. So, yeah.
Then I think it may come down to a legal determination on the code for the duration. It may be that at the end of that, we're fine, yay. If we want to see changes, then we're going to have to develop a process for that and follow the notification, because it timed it to the grant cycles and also people had enough time to adjust.
I think the committee began its work a long time ago, talking about these in very great detail and with robust debate and discussion, but with always with an understanding that at some point we would want to take a look and see whether it's accomplishing what we wanted it to accomplish. And so this is really an essential part of the process, I think. Yeah.
One next step could I inquire about? We earlier talked about the effort to rebrand so that we can be clear this is transit funding, and is it possible to maybe circle back that in September? Because by the time we hit October and you're putting the grant applications out, I think you're going to want to be branded. In a nice way branded.
It's one of the things on the priority list of getting ready for these meetings that seem to come in very rapid succession that has kind of fallen down the list, but we'll bring it back up to the top.
That has a lot of merit.
Good.
If you're familiar with our Virginia Breeze intercity bus service, that name also came out of our staff.
Ah, very good. Okay.
So.
Well, noting that we are sort of drifting into uncharted waters here, it might be a good time to just ask if anybody else has anything they'd like to bring forward. Hearing nothing. And Jen, you're all set with everything that we needed to accomplish today?
I think we do have one more person at least that wants to.
I was going to say, do we have public comment?
Yes.
Okay. Those who've signed up for public comment? This is a familiar face.
I didn't sign up. I didn't know I was. But I mean, yeah, my name is Zach Trogdon. I'm with Williamsburg Area Transit Authority, and I was actually here due to the discussion about the major expansion, you know, and among the regions, and so I know all of you have a difficult task ahead of you to get all these things in place from House Bill 1359 in a very short time. It's not an enviable task, but. I want to thank you all for your dedication to listening to the agencies and really to receive and consider the concerns that we brought. I was involved in the discussions with HRT to bring some of the concerns forward about the impact of the prioritization criteria, and whether, you know, I think our concern was whether it just reinforced any structural imbalances among, you know, agencies and stuff like that. So. You know, with Blacksburg and Charlottesville getting all the money and stuff like that, you know, we want to make sure that wasn't going to get any worse. So, but I think from hearing you all today, and that's why I was kind of waiting until the last public comment period, was say, you know, while none of us expect the outcome to be perfect, you know, I see that you all are dedicated to the integrity and the equitable, you know, equitable distribution of the process and how to get through it. So, so I just want to thank you all. And, you know, I was in local government stuff a long time myself, and rarely do you get, you know, lauded for doing what you're doing. So I want to kind of pay it forward and to say thanks for at least going through this process. And anything else as you go through this, I think the agencies certainly, you know, are happy to provide their feedback and do whatever we can to give you any feedback you might need. So, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trogdon. Any other public comment? Yes.
Thank you again. Still LJ Hansen with Suffolk Transit. Again, I want to echo what Zach said. I really appreciate the opportunity, one, to be able to speak, and two, for all the work that you all are putting in. I know it's a yeoman's job you've got ahead of you. There's a lot to be resolved yet. You know, historically, well, I'm relatively new to what is happening in the process. I wasn't around for a lot of the original stuff, and there's a lot of people here with a lot more experience than I have. But what I will tell you is that in the time that I have been involved with public transit, we've always said there wasn't enough money, but we were all in it together. And I think when House Bill 1359 came out, the concern on some of our parts, and perhaps my more cynical side, is that this is going to create competition. And I heard the word competition a lot today. And that pits us against each other, and that is one of my greatest concerns, and I heard that from you, Mr. Dyke, today, that certainly there's just not enough funding, and we need to understand that. But what I really hope that we can do in this process, and what I hope you all keep in the forefront of your mind, is we are in it together, because even if our system succeeds and our neighboring systems fail, we fail. And so I hope that we can keep that in mind. With that thought in mind, I would like to talk a little bit about Smart Scale. I'll try and keep my comments real brief. But Smart Scale was put together for transportation purposes, and I feel confident that in large part it was put together for roadway projects. Each region got a certain amount of money, and so each region then developed their own priority process, looking at in northern Suffolk, or in northern Virginia and in Hampton Roads. Of course, we put congestion very high on our list. But now I have to wonder if a project in northern Virginia, will it address congestion more than an economic development project in Fredericksburg? And so I'm curious about this whole process of normalizing. And I looked at the information that was put together by Cambridge, and I appreciate that. But that was put together on smart scale applications. In other words, those were projects that transit professionals thought would compete well in the smart scale process. Most of us know whether a project's going to do well or not. If it's not going to do well, we're not going to submit it. So I'm curious to know how some of the other projects will look in this process. The projects that we deemed not worthy to be submitted for smart scale. It's a difficult process, and if we don't think it's going to compete, we're not going to go through that problem. So I guess I'm curious to look at some of the other capital projects that may be submitted to DRPT. And I just ask that we just bear in mind that there are more projects out there than what were submitted in the Cambridge analysis. Also, you had a great discussion about using GIS for some measures. I think in cases like that, please make sure that we use a standard, that it's not a locally determined GIS application, because you're going to have different metrics. You're going to have skewing. It should be based upon something that's standard. U.S. Census, statewide GIS plane, whatever the scenario might be. And then last, I did want to just mention something about operating, and this is definitely going to apply to the smaller systems, to all the systems, but probably this is the area where the smaller systems are more concerned. Again, going back to the notion of competition, when the service delivery factors were installed, that was supposed to be on at that point, the new money, right? There was a baseline, and that the service delivery factors would only be applied to the new money. Now it's going to be for all monies. And again, we're getting back into this place where you have small systems that are going to be competing against each other. Are they competing based upon, is it an all-in? Is it everybody just trying to fight for it? I've used the analogy, and I I hope it's not true, the Hunger Games approach where we're all just fighting for whatever scarce resources are out there? Or are we going to have some type of a tiered approach? And these are just things that, at least they're on the forefront of my mind. If they're on my mind and I have so little experience, they've got to be on others that can't be here today. And so I just hope that you keep those things in mind. And again, I don't want to end on any type of a negative thought. I really think that you all are doing a great job. I appreciate all the effort that you're putting into it, and I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak today.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. Anybody else? Is that it? Okay. Any other comments from members of the committee? If not, we'll adjourn.
All right. Thank you.
Good job, Mr. Chairman.